Welcome to Recovery with Root, a podcast centered on topics surrounding mental health and addiction. Through our Advanced Recovery Institute, a new entity of the Root Center for Advanced Recovery, we are committed to research and training to elevate clinical care. We hope you find this podcast informative, and most of all, we hope that it helps improve the lives of others. Remember, we're in this together, and recovery is possible.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Recovery with Root. I'm Margot Farrell, Chief of Staff here at the Root Center for Advanced Recovery, joined today by Liz Evans, Director of Harm Reduction Services at Liberation Programs, based in Bridgeport. That name may sound familiar if you follow our content. She was a panelist at one of our community forums. Liz, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So excited to continue this conversation. I was chatting with you a little bit briefly before. You come to us from Canada, and so you have some different perspectives when it comes to harm reduction and just some different stories and kind of tales that you can tell about really why it does work. So I wanted to expand that conversation that we had on harm reduction a few months ago and just kind of see where it goes today.
Great.
Tell me a little bit about, I guess, your past and how you got into even this career.
Yeah, well, it was definitely not planned. My background is actually in nursing. I studied at Ottawa University and ended up, while I was a nursing student, meeting a lot of women who were homeless and on the street because I volunteered at a couple of homeless shelters. And most of them were also involved in one way or other in the mental health system. So when I graduated, I started working in psychiatry, which I did for a couple of years. And then I moved out to Vancouver, where I worked in an emergency department at an inner city hospital, where it was very sad because people were coming in acute crisis and their lives were often in crisis. And even though they were presenting with an acute mental health crisis in psychiatry, there was very little we could really do for a lot of the situations that people were in. And I felt like people were singularly looked at as a diagnosis and as symptoms rather than in the context of their lives, which frustrated me and it made me very sad. So I used to go home, cry, think, why am I here? I feel like I can't do anything. The medicine isn't the answer. People need so much more. At which point, I met a social worker who introduced me to an organization that was a sort of a bit of a radical activist kind of nonprofit who had a history of fighting for housing rights for folks in a low-income community. And I went down there and applied for a job. They'd just taken over the management of a single room occupancy SRO hotel. And they asked me if I was interested in running a small mental health program that they were funded to provide for 10 people out of the context of a 70-room SRO to support people living with mental illness. So I said, sure. And I literally, after the interview, walked home and the phone rang and said, can you start now? And I turned around and started working that day. So it was a lot.
I think that speaks to the need.
Yeah,
right?
the need was huge.
Calling you back right away.
Yeah, and there was no one else. It had never opened. It was a brand new project. And so I ended up basically running the hotel because the person they hired to manage it left after a couple of months. It was an intense community, a very intense low-income neighborhood with probably 6,000 to 7,000 people living there who were injection drug users and on the street. The community itself had gone through a lot of different changes, economic shifts and patterns, and then a lot of boarded up shops, closed bars that became occupied by dealers. And so the intensity of the street level drug use and poverty and 10,000 people in a 8-block radius, mostly living in single room occupancy hotels that were run by private landlords. So really intense community to be in at a time when there were really nothing for people who were active drug users other than the traditional services that had always been around. So really I walked into a situation that I was fully unprepared for, and met people and filled a building with people that were complicated. They had histories of mental health addiction. Most had been incarcerated. Most had behavior sort of challenges, really sad stories, and of course got to know and really love and care about the people that I met. So I always say they were my teachers, listening to people and understanding who they were and being more interested in them than their addiction. It was never really for me about addiction. It was like understanding who people were, what their stories were, how they ended up there, and what they wanted. And I think for me, when I started, I had this naive and well-meaning intention and belief that I could just help people. I mean, who the hell was I? 25-year-old Girl Guide just at a nursing school, walking into a community with people whose lives had, existed for 30, 40 years, had 20 years of trauma, saw, childhood sexual abuse, like just unbelievable stories. And I'm going to help. So I had to learn how to let go and of a lot of the things that I thought helped people and just really, really, truly just be with people and listen. And, trying to think in my mind, oh, the best thing for this person is to get them off drugs. And then listening. And so I had this one teacher, I always say, her name was Shannon. I used to say to her every day, so you want to go to detox today? And she'd say, yes, absolutely. And then I'd go to make a call and she'd disappear. And then it'd go on like this dance for days and days. And then eventually I said to her, Shannon, do you really want to go to detox? And she goes, no. And I'm like, why do you keep telling me you want to go? And she said, because I think that's what you want me to say. And I'm like, okay, look, I really don't. I want to know what you actually want. And she said, what I really need is a pair of new curtains. I'm like, okay, I can do that. I can hang you some new curtains. Um, so yeah, I learned, okay, it's not what I want, it's what people need. And then learned how to just sit with that.
How long until you found your way to Bridgeport?
Oh God, years. I mean, I was in Vancouver for 23 years. And then I came to New York and I was there for a few years. And then I came to Bridgeport 2.5 years ago.
And working in the harm reduction space with that knowledge that you have from when you started out in your career, I imagine that's something that you use to implement now all the time.
So yeah, I mean, I was very honored to be asked by John Hamilton to join Liberation and try and integrate harm reduction into a traditional behavioral health organization focused historically on treatment. And to really kind of eke out where those points of tension are as well as those opportunities. And I think it's largely been opportunities. But that's not to say there isn't a struggle in this country for everybody, not just people who work in behavioral health, to sort of really understand harm reduction as a sort of a different philosophy, but one that can complement and integrate well with treatment, but it's not the same. And so it's hard sometimes for people to be comfortable with that when they're historically well versed in a sort of abstinence based ideology, one that really says the best thing for people is to not use drugs. Because there's always this narrative clean, dirty, using, not using, even how we think we're helping, right? We're helping if we're focused on helping that person get off drugs, right? And then I believe what we've failed to do because of that black and white thinking is not only stigmatize people that are using inadvertently by our language and our approach, but also miss a ton of opportunities where we can help people that are somewhere in that gray space of supporting and being with and helping people while they're still actively using whatever it is they are using. And historically, there's been this belief, I think, that if we help people while they're using, somehow we're condoning their use, or that we're enabling their use, or we're somehow making it easier or more attractive for them to continue using. But from my perspective and from the work I've done, I would say the absolute opposite is true. If you can extend love and compassion to another human being who typically feel worthless and unvalued, it helps people to restore a sense of self and reinitiate a conversation rooted in authenticity and honesty. And then they can talk to you more openly about their relationship with drugs. And you can have a more real conversation about what's going on, as opposed to people feeling they need to tell you what it is you want to hear.
And with your experiences seeing kind of the Canadian model with how harm reduction is definitely, I think, more accessible, more approved of than maybe we're seeing here. Can you speak maybe to debunk a little bit of the myths that you kind of touched on some of them there? Like, we're condoning it if we're doing that. But what have you seen when it's actually implemented in terms of how it does impact people?
I mean, harm reduction is more than just one thing, it's a broad array of interventions and programs that we can provide people while they're still using. And I think, like here in Canada, there was always a conversation. It was never a simple thing. When we walked into this work, it was amidst a lot of overdose deaths. The first wave of overdose deaths were happening in the late 90s. We had to do a lot of awareness, a lot of education, a lot of conversations. And at that time, we initiated something called the 4 Pillars strategy, where we put harm reduction alongside treatment, enforcement, and prevention as an equal pillar. And to do that, we had to integrate a drug policy coordinator into our city. We did a lot of work with churches and the faith community. We did a lot of work in public venues like libraries, community centers. We did this panel that floated around for 2 years, almost making presentations. And then we talked with drug users and they amplified their voices. And we talked with family members and amplified their voices. And really at a time when there was a lot of sadness, a lot of death, a lot of HIV, a lot of overdoses. And we said, look, this isn't good enough. The status quo isn't working. We need new solutions. And let's explore and find out what's out there that we can integrate into the way we consider treatment and helping people. And part of that was the opening of the overdose prevention site, or the injection site insight, which opened in 2003. It opened after 7 years of conversation and planning and a giant municipal election that was basically won and lost on that issue, which wiped out the municipal party that had been in power for 14 years, like literally, because the party that was running was in support and they were against, and it literally destroyed them. Because the public had changed their opinion and come to see it as something that was needed and no longer something that was an option. And so what we saw was not only a change of public opinion, but we also saw a change in policy across the board, where housing providers, treatment providers, healthcare providers had to start integrating, working with a lower barrier approach to people while they were still using in order to engage them in services. Because what we were able to prove was that they were not engaged. They only used the emergency department or the police. And the police aren't healthcare workers, and they were frustrated. So whatever system of care it was that we were brushing up against, we had to try and, really work with to figure out ways of integrating an at-risk population that were being excluded from services. So what we saw was way more people getting services and care. What we saw were not the crises people who were opposed thought we would see, like, for instance, young people are going to start using drugs earlier. If we open an injection site, it's going to look like an attractive option, which of course it doesn't. An injection site literally is a place where people don't die because they can connect with services. They have an overdose intervention provided if they do overdose. We built a detox upstairs so people could literally transition right upstairs if they wanted to get off the street and get a break. And then we built a sort of continuum of other programs, including housing, which was complicated, but really, really necessary to stabilize people's lives in terms of their housing. That was really the priority.
Wow, though, so you're talking early 2000s, and here we are in 2024 in the US. What do you think is the biggest barrier, the biggest difference as to maybe why we're not there yet here?
I think people here care a lot. They just don't know how to care for people that have been so heavily stigmatized. And I think, it's changing. And I do believe people are understanding that harm reduction makes sense now. I've definitely felt much more receptivity to this sort of ideology now than I've ever felt in the US. But the US was like born on the war on drugs and the whole notion of this fight that we have to have, whether it's a fight against addiction or a fight against people who use drugs. Ultimately, even saying we're fighting addiction is sort of like saying we're fighting people that use drugs, even though, of course, we don't want people to struggle and suffer. And addiction is a very heavy burden. It's very hard for people. But people don't elect to use drugs typically for fun. I mean, some people obviously start because it's a relief and it's pleasurable and they find relief. But most people I've worked with, I would say everybody I've ever worked with, has some form of psychological pain or suffering that they're struggling with, and the drugs are the remedy. It becomes very complicated to say, now I'm going to take those away from you and replace them with nothing. You have to work with where a person's at and help them rebuild their life. But we have this ideology that's in our DNA in this country that it's the drugs that's the problem. And until we distinguish between the root of the problem,
The root.
and they're called root, so that's an appropriate term. Yeah, what is the root of the issue here? Is it the drug? I mean, I think we've simplified it down to that. I think that's a mistake.
Well, because you've also touched on the mental health issues that are coming. I mean, a lot of times this is co-occurring. It's not a one-way street. So how do we also acknowledge that once we take the drug away, are we addressing the mental health aspect of things? Because that's not as easy to just pull away. I mean, the drug is the tangible thing, but what about the things that may be inside?
Yeah, I mean, it is all inside. People's lives have been, a lot of people I've met over the years have experienced intense pain. I mean, what I learned from the first folks that I met in that community was life changing. Women who would tell me about these harrowing stories. And then I would look at their drug use and I'd think, wow, you are actually a heroic, strong, unbelievable human being to be alive today. The fact that you're banging cocaine into your neck is really not the problem. The problem is no one was there for you when you were going through all of this stuff in your childhood or in your adult life, or the fact that you were raped last week and you're scared to call the police because you know you'll get treated poorly because you're a sex worker. Like, whatever that person's life experience might be, it's in a context, and the solutions to these problems are not just about fixing the drug problem. And I would say that harm reduction differentiates itself somewhat from the sort of historical drug treatment industry by saying, look, this isn't just about this person's individual relationship with the drug. It takes place in a larger social, economic, political climate. So the interventions need to also look at those situations. Like, we know racial justice is a huge issue in the US. We know that people who use the same drugs were incarcerated at completely different rates depending on the color of their skin. So policies don't get applied evenly because we're not looking at those context pieces, which are critical, I think, in resolving policies that will actually make a dent in the overdose epidemic.
Well, then when you hear that, you almost think to yourself, well, where do we begin? How do we begin to change that conversation, change the perspective? I mean, you talk a lot about the work you did in Canada and going on tours to talk to people. You came to our forum, it's like, what else can we do? It's almost, it begs that question.
Yeah, well, I think it is a bit overwhelming. Honestly, sometimes I felt like I could handle the community I was in because it was small. We could, see change in our neighborhood. And so it was worth, all the work that we did there to try and make that change. But, even that, like, politics change, intentions change, things can get wiped out, things can change again. It is very, very difficult. I don't know, because it's a larger story than about that one individual and their relationship to substances. But I think ultimately bringing kindness to the narrative is never going to hurt. And I think bringing empathy to people and understanding their suffering and not perpetuating suffering, I think, is where we start. And we have to look at the policies that perpetuate the stigma and the suffering. And I do believe change can happen on systemic levels. I've seen it happen on systemic levels. I've seen entire systems completely change the way they operate as a result of that kind of kindness and empathy coming into practices that were previously very restrictive. Even simply thinking about housing policy, right? Like, historically, there was a term that got used that a person had to be housing ready in order to be eligible to live in a social housing project. And that term disappeared entirely. And then it was like, how are we as housing providers running housing? What are we doing to make it low barrier enough that we're catching the folks that we're currently missing in the net because we're too restrictive?
I see. And so, I mean, it all comes back to the conversation, right? Like, we have to keep having the conversation. Do you think now in 2024, where would you kind of rank us into where you were back in the early 2000s, right? When everything kind of came to fruition, where do you think we fall right now with where we are? What do you see?
That's very different here. I mean, it's not Canada. The whole culture is
as
different.
Close as we
the
can
country is different. The healthcare
Yes.
system is different. It's a very different place. And, I think it's difficult to compare like that because it's not really apples and apples. I think the conversation about harm reduction is is coming along and building momentum. And I do think people do care. I think everyone in this country is touched by someone, either with a significant mental health or drug related issue. We all know someone who we love and care about. Most people do. In fact, we're not very far away, everybody in this country, someone who's died of an overdose. Most families have been impacted. So I don't believe there isn't the knowledge or the awareness of the problem. I think the problem is more about the diagnosis of the problem and how we can tease out more broadly the space that's available to us to work in that we're not currently working in. So we have this narrative that we can only work with people when they're prepared to change, but I believe we can work with people regardless of where they are.
And then there's also the element of what are they willing to change too, which goes into harm reduction. And just, maybe when you put up that woman's curtains, her outlook, I mean, how did her outlook change, with those simple gestures of love and kindness that you're talking about, getting someone to maybe use less or not as frequently, like, that's still a win.
Yeah. And I think A lot of people, when they think about syringe exchange programs, for instance, or even just any kind of harm reduction initiative where you're actually talking to people about safer use or minimizing use or switching how they use or just giving them information about wound care or whatever aspect of sort of the actual act of doing drugs itself that you're informing people about, again, it comes back to this narrative. Like, if it's just up to that individual to change the relationship they have with drugs, then can we at least believe they have some agency in that? And I believe they do. And I don't believe drugs possess a person's soul to the degree that they have no agency, that they can't say, okay, you know what, I'm never going to use a dirty needle again. That's progress, right? Like, we know on average, if we're talking about injection drug users, they stay addicted in their injection drug use pattern on average between 12 and 14 years. So I always say we have a choice about how we choose to treat people within that 12 to 14-year period, because how they come out of it is going to be seriously impacted by that. Do we want them coming out with one arm because they've got gangrene, or do we want them to die during that 12-year period and not give them the opportunity to ever recover? And we always used to say in Vancouver, the dead don't detox. If what you want is hope for people, then let's treat people with hope while they're still using. Keep them healthy, keep them loved, keep them supported as best as we can to minimize the damage that's going to happen as a result, because we perpetuate that stigma and that harm and cause more trauma by not doing that.
What do you think is the one thing that links everything together in terms of how we get to the other side? Like, what is, the one thing that we could all strive to implement in our lives to maybe make a difference at some level? Is it start with that kindness? Does it start with the thought change?
I don't know. I do a lot of talking about how harm reduction is value neutral. And I think that's a helpful construct for people to have, because it's simple, right? But harm reduction isn't like, oh, you're a bad person because you're using drugs, nor is it, oh, you're great because you're using drugs. It's just, you're using drugs. There is a reality to it, which is, I'm not going to stick my head in the sand and pretend people are not using. Do I wish they weren't? Of course. Do I wish I could give everybody a high quality of life and happiness? Absolutely. But I can't, and I've tried, and I had to learn many lessons along the way. And also, the other thing is, I would say we need to integrate this sort of belief that drug use is value neutral and not get all loaded up and inflamed about it when it's real. But the other piece is, it's not about us, right? So we want to insert ourselves a lot into other people's stories. But really, I think the great value is actually learning and listening and sitting back and becoming students of other people's lives and giving them the respect that they deserve. And I have seen that when that relationship dynamic changes, I have seen people feel incredibly empowered. It's very humbling. People want the best for themselves. They need to believe other people around them also want that for them. And they can only believe that when they feel safe and trusted.
Do you have any experiences that stick out in your mind over the years of like, this is it. This is why I do this. It works. Like, what keeps you going?
Oh, thousands of interactions with individuals that I cared about and loved that were profoundly beautiful. It was less about change and more about what I think about transformation, like the dynamic of a human coming into a place where they feel loved and seen. It's incredibly powerful. People who have just felt invisibilized and beaten down, and understanding how that reciprocal love, that trust, that empathy, that, you know, that space opens up so much for people. And it does open up hope, because it opens up in them a sort of a light where they feel they're valuable. I mean, even simple things like when the injection site opened, we had these mirrors at every booth, and people would come up and, the staff would be super friendly and welcoming and come on in, and, and then give them all this advice about how to find a vein and how not to get infections, and really non-judgmental and just helpful and kind. And I'd hear these people saying, "Oh my God, why are you being so nice to me? Like, the fact maybe I should be nicer to myself." Comments like that, and then they'd see themselves in this mirror. And for some people, they hadn't looked at themselves in a mirror for a long time. And then they're sitting there and they're like, "Oh my God, I'm terrible. I look so drawn. I look so tired. I look so beaten up." And
The reality sets in.
yeah. And then people are like, "Oh, people are being kind to me. I feel like shit. I look like shit. Maybe I should actually be a bit kinder to myself." So it's not instant. For some people it is, but for most people it's a process. And it, I believe, starts with that belief in hope for themselves. And that, I think, ultimately is in a powerful dynamic when people feel trusted and loved.
Well, I think sometimes, maybe what stops people with harm reduction is that they're just visualizing it as one thing. Like it's a clean needle, or it's a place where someone can go for a safe consumption site. And there's so much more in there. I mean, you're touching on housing, and you're touching on, even just giving somebody the feeling that they're valued, giving the person a place that's warm to sit in. It's so much more than just, you're giving someone something to help them utilize the drugs. It's such a bigger topic than
I
that.
know people get really triggered sometimes by the whole idea of handing someone a crack pipe. And I always like to say, look, the thing about handing someone a crack pipe, not only is there obviously a public health reason to be providing these supplies to people because they're clean and hygienic and we're not transferring diseases and we're all doing all those good public health things, which are all very, very important. But we're also engaging with people who are sort of on the bottom of the totem pole in terms of drug users, right? Like nobody talks to them, people blame them, they're vilified, they're often arrested. If you give somebody some clean supplies who happens to also be addicted to crack, it's the beginning of a relationship. And I always feel really proud of the fact that in Bridgeport, lots of the people that we're engaging with every day on the van are people who are involved in crack use because nobody wants to talk to them. But if they want help, they come to us because they start to feel, okay, these guys care about me. I've got someone to talk to now. There's a door. So I think what you're talking about is really the most powerful component of harm reduction, which is it's non-judgmental. And it's, for me, everything I've ever done is really about space. I always say it's like opening up space, human space, physical space, medical space, policy space. It's about how do we create that space for people that have been pushed out and incarcerated and criminalized and beaten down. And, when we shift our mindset about what the challenges are, then it really opens up a lot more opportunities for us to create programs that are welcoming, shift policies that are more inclusive, train our staff to be more non-judgmental.
It really sounds like a lot of it, both from making the individual feel loved to making the public aware, it all comes down to having that conversation and being open. And as you need to use your word, to give people space. Because it seems that if, we're not having the conversation in the public, you're certainly not going to change or sway anybody's mind because no one's talking about it. If you're not having the conversation with the individual, then how are you going to make a connection or make that person feel that they have somewhere or someone to go to? Because I'm sure so much of this is alone.
Well, and that's why we have these harrowing statistics of people dying literally on the other side of a wall where someone is in the same home with them and they haven't talked to them about the fact that they're using because they're so ashamed and they're hiding. And we always, have this health message, don't use alone because you can die. But the truth is people use alone because they don't want people to know they're using because they can't face the repercussions of that.
We also, that you just reminded me, because we had an event for Overdose Awareness Day, and one of the things that one of our senators, Senator Anwar, mentioned, he said a lot of times people are passing away and there's a bottle of Narcan sitting next to them, but they're alone. So nobody has been able to administer that to them. And so it's preventable. And that our next forum is actually on loneliness and talking about, how that impacts people, not just, maybe in the addiction sense, but just overall. And I think loneliness is really kind of the root of, I keep adding root in there, but it really comes back to the root of what it all is we're missing that connection, whether it is to change somebody's mind on what we're doing or to get somebody to get help. It's that loneliness. How do we even bridge that gap and that barrier? It's just,
we need each other and we need communities and we need fellowship and we need love and we need community and things to do, meaningful employment, activity, to feel valued, all those things. And so much about how we live now is in isolation and in competition. And
more like the most connected we've ever been, yet also we're seeing the highest rates of all this, this stuff from people suffering from different things on different ends of the spectrum. And it comes back to that connection aspect. What do you think is the one thing, if you had someone who's listening to this and they're just they've never been on board with it, or they're just not aware of it, what is one thing that you want them to take away from it, or just know? What do you think is the biggest misconception?
well, I would say over the years of meeting people and listening to them, it's hard sometimes for us to change our minds. It's challenging. But ultimately, if we look in ourselves and ask ourselves the question why we're so bothered by it, like what is it about this way of thinking about people who use drugs that we find so unsettling, and what angers us, it's usually connected to something we personally are struggling with ourselves, whether it was a situation that we've experienced personally with a family member that was difficult. And I'm not underestimating how difficult it can be to have people struggling with drug use in our families, um, or ourselves, right? Like, um, I do think, going to therapy, learning to love ourselves, learning to heal is the same journey that everyone needs to be on in terms of our own pain. And I think any intolerance, anything that causes us to judge another person, another human being for something, whatever it is, whether it's their drug use or their homosexuality or their whatever, is typically rooted in something inside of ourselves that finds it hard to accept that about another human. So I always think the answer for all of this stuff is healing, bringing forgiveness into our own lives, breathing, self-care, looking after ourselves, and trying to understand what it means to live in community with people that are diverse and different and doing their best.
It's interesting you say, healing, because it's like that's what they're worried about is other people. Why aren't they healing? And it's like, well, is there maybe something inside? Because I mean, at the end of the day, it's all about just making sure that we're all healthy and happy as much as we can be.
Yeah. And why would that be threatening to anyone ultimately?
Right. Why would someone else's way of life cause any indifference to yours? You talked about too, being on the street in Bridgeport and with your van. What are some of the experiences that you can take away from that have helped shape you?
I think, people who use drugs in the US have not been historically thought of as included in society. And I don't think that's any different in Bridgeport or anywhere in Fairfield County that we're working with active drug users. I think it's hard for them. I think a lot of people have heavy mistrust of law enforcement, and just scared. So we see people, hiding their use, not wanting to talk about their use. But I've also been very um, honored to get to know a lot of stories there. Certainly our team has. It's certainly not me. I'm not on the front line as much as I wish it could be. But the staff who go out have hundreds of stories all the time about people who share things and who they feel privileged to have met to be part of their lives. And community has definitely developed there, between the staff and the folks that we serve and who now come to the office on a pretty regular basis. So I do get to meet lots of folks. And then the other piece that we've really been heavily leaning into is the correlation between the homeless folks, but folks experiencing homelessness in our community. And we've recently added a homeless outreach team to our staff, which has been incredible. So now we have 5 actual dedicated positions who are solely dedicated to working with the unsheltered homeless throughout either the train stations or across Fairfield County. So in collaboration with a few other groups, we're doing that, and it's pretty phenomenal.
Wow. And it again just goes to show there's so many different elements. And I think housing seems to be really another big barrier that just keeps coming up that maybe perpetuates the problem as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of people actively working on trying to find solutions to the housing crisis, but it is a crisis for all people.
And when you don't have some place to lay your head at night, it's kind of like that's just another problem to add to your laundry list.
Yeah, it's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. How do you develop any kind of relationship that's stable with your drug use or your mental health or anything that's going on in your life? If it's physical medication that you need, or if it's, basic appointments that you have to go to, how do you navigate that from living in a park with no cell phone often, or, people can't charge their cell phones on trees? Like it's, people don't think about the practicality of, you know, being outside. And now it's getting cold and people's lives are hard, and so just practical things that they need um, make navigating the system very difficult without a shelter. So having a shelter, having a home is a massively important step in helping people achieve stability.
I always find it interesting. I'd gone so we have harm reduction rovers that we've implemented at different clinics, and I've been to one of our clinics on one of the days when they had it there, and it was always so inspiring to me. The takeaway from that day was I think what I found the most special was the patients who came in and they didn't even want anything from the rover. They just wanted to come say hello to the gentleman, Cameron Breen, who you know from the forum as well. They wanted to just come and say hello to him.
Mm-hmm.
And just the way they came into the clinic and the way they left the clinic, like their spirits were so different. And I thought that was the biggest takeaway because again, I think some people are thinking, well, if you're going to give people this, they're going to come take it. And I'm like, there's so many people that literally just came in for a hello or a granola bar. I mean, things that you would not even think of.
Yeah, we have people every day coming in just to say hi and grab a bottle of water, check in. Mm-hmm.
That human connection is so important.
I hate to tell you, Cameron's at home.
Oh my goodness. Hey, it's a small world. And we're all working for the same mission, you know?
I'm very lucky to have him.
That's so funny. Yeah. I mean, it's a lot of times the people who I interview in these scenarios, we all have some connection. It's somebody who's put us in touch with someone else. And at the end of the day, we all have that same drive. And I could tell right when I met Cameron that he was that type of individual who just sees people as people.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just, it's incredible to see the work that is happening. I hope that we keep progressing in the right direction. I think having folks like you, like Cameron, and all these people on the front line who share a like-minded drive and a like-minded passion for others is just really inspiring. So I thank you for sharing your insight and, for talking to Root on more than one occasion. And, we really value having your background and your dedication to this. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, we hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast, Recovery with Root. As always, stay connected with us on social media to learn about when next podcast episodes will drop. You can comment, ask questions, even let us know about future topics that you'd like to see discussed. Until next time, remember, progress is the destination.